Well, consciousness is a biggie. That's the biggest of all. I mean, if we explore together the vocabulary that surrounds this topic, I would say consciousness would be number one. It's been used all over the time, traditions, and the only pity about this word is that it's taken for something very abstract, very far out, very away, to be reached at some point. And actually, by starting that way, starting in the way of assuming that consciousness is not something that is already existing right now, we are shooting in our own foot. And in that sense, there would be a kind of hamster wheel developing, trying to chase something that's already here. That means we are just moving, but not really gaining anything out of that. So it's urgent, it's essential to go back to what it means, really, and to go back to the basics. And part of the exploration I propose most of the time is about finding what is the experience of consciousness, and what is, and that's the interesting part, what I call the objects of consciousness, which is actually what we assume that's the interesting part in the world. And I say, well, that's interesting, but that's not the essence. The essence is before that. And so together we just go there and we look at the situation and we realize together that this information that we call consciousness is actually here all the time for all of us, and there is no requirement of any awakening or any special experience for that. It is our natural state. Awakening has a meaning that is interesting in the sense that it points to a possibility of recognizing who we really are. And this recognition is an event. I'm not denying that there is no event, but then it comes with an implicit conclusion, which is most of the time the reason why this recognition is not happening. And the implicit conclusion is, I want to have my awakening. It's my story, and I'm entitled to receive the benefits of my search, of my investment into this search. And by doing that, I want my awakening. If we start with that, again, there will be no end to the hamster wheel. So the whole thing about awakening is to recognize there is a possibility of something else. And the second sentence that should come with that, but this something else doesn't concern you, doesn't concern Alain, doesn't concern Didier. So, who is concerned about that? That's the real question. And the answer, the living answer of who is concerned about that, is the answer of all the questions. I am that is a pointer. It's clearly everything we're going to say, everything that's going to be exchanged today and in any time is, first, it's not the truth. It is a kind of verbalization, a kind of conceptualization of something that is direct, that is raw, that is much, much beyond the words. And when Nisargadatta said, I am that, well, he wanted to point out that that which I am is what I would say life. That is, anything that happens is that, and it's not out of that, it's made out of that, it is from that, it is all, there is no way to get out of that, and that I am. And at the end you could even say, simplify and say I am. And that would be even a closer approach to the same thing, but I am would be already very much misunderstood. And when you go to one step further, you have silence. You can say I, and even that, who is going to be understanding anything from the word I? And then after silence, that's where we have meditation, that's where we have different techniques. But I am that is a very elaborate version of an answer about this quest. Who am I? I am that. Well, I'm a sound engineer. So about sound is kind of my field all my life, and I've been busy with that. And the thing I realized through my work as a sound engineer is that there is nothing like silence. It doesn't exist. Silence is not part of this world. It's not part of this experience of life. And the silence, which is the absence of sound, is what I would call the ground base, the base where everything arises from, the source or whatever, which is the real silence, which is not only the absence of sound, but the absence of sound. So it's both. It's negating both the presence and the absence of sound, which is allowing the sound to be appearing. Without that, without reference level, there would be nothing. I mean, it's a little bit like you think about digital recordings. You have anything starting from 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. That's the real silence, but that doesn't exist. There will be always a modulation of it, and by a modulation there is an expression of it, and this expression, we call it life. And actually silence is I would say this base of 0, 0, 0 is what we really are, but it's always modulated in a way or another way. Well, suffering and happiness are interlinked. It's my definition, again, that's up to everybody to agree or not, is that happiness is the absence of suffering, and suffering is the absence of happiness. And they are actually totally linked together. And so by defining what is suffering, we might be able to understand what remains when suffering is not there. And then that will be called a happiness, which I would not be able to define. So if we talk about suffering, pure suffering, it is the absence of specific, I would say, habits, because it's at the end it's not different from a conditioning that triggers this sense of me, of poor me or great me, which is also suffering in my view. The pride is also very much suffering. The guilt is suffering. Shame is suffering. So all these elements, all these flavors of life appear because of the initial supposition of an entity that is there at the center. If the entity is seen to be non-existent, this suffering has no ground to grow, has no root to exist, and disappears. So that's why I always say suffering is optional. That means by seeing that the whole part of life that we call suffering disappears, and what remains, I would say that's what we call happiness. Conditioning is one of the aspects of all the, I would say, the dance of the inputs and the outputs in life. And you have a state, this discussion, for example, that's the initial state, and the next word that's going to be out is growing out of the initial state and creates a new initial state, and then a new initial state. And what are the rules of the dance? Because there is a kind of rule. There is a maestro, maybe not a real one, but something that is guiding the next word and the next word. And this guidance has been found to be based on life itself. And so when we talk about conditioning, it's not only about my own small conditioning, it is actually the conditioning of all the aspects in presence right now. It's not just this small body mind or this specific DNA or these traumas or whatever. It is all elements that are in place at a specific time, part of the story. It's not different from a story, and that creates the state +1, which is the next word, next action. So conditioning, I don't see it as something bad or good, and surely not as something personal. Conditioning means there is an initial state, and from that state the next one will emerge. That's all. That's a loaded word. I mean, I would use it. I have no problem with that. It's just that for some of the words we've been using all our life, like God or that type of specific word, is so much loaded with preconception, stuff that it's believed or added, so that the word itself becomes meaningless, because it's just a bunch of assumptions that are stacked together, glued together, and then we assume that the word means something or points to something, but in this case it's going to be just a sound. God it could be dog, but in this case it's God. So divine is a bit less loaded in a way, but I would also be very careful about that, because divine means that there are two sides of this story. One side is the divine one, and one side is the human one, or the one that is much more at our level. And by doing that, by doing just that, we split the world, we split our experience in two parts, and immediately we create the suffering that we try to solve in the first place. So the divine would be used to recognize that it is already what is happening here, and it's not something, a special state or entity, or to reach or to be discovered in the future, but to be recognized in this seat, in this conversation, in this environment. That's the divine. That's my definition of the divine. Life, the only thing that really can be said to be a truth, because if you just ask anybody, are you alive? Is there life? If even are you alive could be discussed. Is there something instead of nothing? Right now there is no way to deny there is something, and that something, I call it life. And that life, if it's recognized to be the only thing that really is, and when I say that, I'm not making it smaller, or I'm just saying it is something, or a set of events, a story, or an experience that is happening. It is also urgent to say that it is not limited to what we call my story, my set of belief, my thing. It is something that is encompassing all, and that is actually in a way totally devoid of individual characteristics or fragmentation, because that's what we were talking about. Non-duality, Advaita, is just to recognize that this usual reading of life, that means myself versus the world, is basically something that's flawed, and that brings a lot of suffering, then a lot of unhappiness, and the only solution for that is to not to create, not to bridge, because there's nothing to bridge, but to recognize that this fragmentation was not required in the first place. The fragmentation, in my view, is an engine of life. The fragmentation is the way life allows itself to write amazing stories, or to read, because it's reading and writing at the same time. So to create like an oyster, when you want to create a beautiful pearl in an oyster, you put a piece of sand inside, and then from that sand there will be a kind of reaction that's going to create layers and stuff and all that, and those can be really beautiful in many ways. And by creating layers, there is a depth, there is a thickness in life, there is a reality to the story that is happening. Like you go to the movie, it's not to see a piece of grass with sheep grazing and nothing happens. There is a thickness in this story of life. So back to what I said before, we have this fragmentation, not because we are punished, there is nobody to be punished, not because we are bad or we need to solve fragmentation, but the fragmentation is going to be the grain of sand that's going to create this pearl of this conversation we have right now.
Thank you.
My pleasure, Alain, always.